Hi, I'm Mary Kopczynski, the CEO of Regulator. Welcome to this week's Regulatory Roundup. This week, there were 1,485 alerts from 329 unique U.S. regulators, and 246 had to do with coronavirus, a lighter-ish week because of the Columbus Day holiday. The regulator of the week is the SEC again. Look, I've read every single regulatory alert for the last 2 years now, and the one regulator that seems to have blazed forward with rule changes and enforcement actions consistently throughout this pandemic is the SEC. Where to even begin? Number one, this week they carved out Series 7 and Series 65 as automatic license to be an accredited investor. Number two, they proposed an exemption for finders. You could be a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 finder and help small businesses raise capital without registering as an official broker-dealer. Number three, they completely overhauled the regulatory framework for fund of funds, so that's fun. Number four, they issued an FAQ for Form CRS, so for those of you following Reg BI, check it out. And finally, they are delaying the final distribution of Wells Fargo's fine money because of a letter written by Broadridge about how it's unfair not to allow the disbursement to be made out to third parties. Really interesting read, especially the Broadridge letter. The topic of the week is broadband. I've mentioned before that this word has been in almost every single state alert just before the pandemic, a massive explosion during the pandemic, especially as it related to schools and the digital divide. A ton of CARES Act funding was designated by the states to go towards their broadband investments. This week, the broadband alerts were not as notable for their quantity as much as it was the permanence of Kentucky's official creation of the Office of Broadband Development. That's the first actual state agency I've seen created to deploy the federal funds. 2 other states announced their allocated funding for broadband this week, Nebraska and Virginia. But in the same breath, this week the Federal Communications Commission happened to announce a meeting of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. So maybe this is just on trend and there's going to be a lot more of these offices to come. And now for those of you following cannabis, the Attorney General of California announced the eradication of more than 1 million illegal marijuana plants. The Marijuana Control Board of Alaska is meeting to discuss marijuana established license applications. The Alaska Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development is also holding a special Marijuana Control Board working group meeting to discuss fine schedules for marijuana violations. And for those of you following climate regs, again, Alaska could have been the regulator of the week. Its Department of Environmental Conservation wants to change regulations on air quality in order to meet the annual 5% reduction in the Clean Air Act. It is also proposing to change rules on landfill monitoring, including better regulatory support for solid waste programs. In Compliance Corner, there was a lot going on this week. In the area of customer identification, watch out. FinCEN, along with the FDIC, the Fed, the OCC, and the NCUA, aka the federal banking agencies, lightened the rules for loans to facilitate purchases of property and casualty insurance policies. So you can get these a little bit easier. Apparently, they don't think there's a high risk of fraud in these products. The FTC is looking for feedback as part of its normal feedback regime. They're focused this week on the Fair Credit Reporting Act and the risk-based pricing rule. SBA and Treasury announced a simpler PPP forgiveness for loans of $50,000 or less. NASA is looking for comments on its proposed continuing education rules for investment advisor representatives. For those of you following RegCap rules and TLAC, the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC revised rules having to do with eligible retained income. Have fun with that. Also, the Fed amended capital planning and stress testing requirements for large bank holding companies, intermediate holding companies, and savings and loan holding companies. Another hot topic this week and during the last few weeks generally has been senior exploitation. In addition to FINRA proposing changes to 2165 last week, which I talked about, this week Missouri increased the penalty for securities violations against elderly individuals. Finally, the FDIC is having its inaugural meeting of the Advisory Committee of State Regulators, which I'm really interested to see where this new collaboration goes. For those of you following crypto, cyber, fintech, and privacy, I had to lob them all into one this week because there was just so much overlap. Let's start with guidance. The United States Department of Justice published a cryptocurrency enforcement framework, which is basically outlining how they're going to be enforcing cryptocurrency. Many of you are already following the SEC and the CFTC, but now you've got a new player in the crypto space to keep your eyes on. They also issued a joint statement with a series of other country enforcers that talks about encryption. They're essentially saying it plays a crucial role in protecting personal data, privacy, intellectual property, trade secrets, and cybersecurity. But what was interesting is they said encryption is an existential anchor of trust in the digital world, and we do not support counterproductive and dangerous approaches that would materially weaken or limit security systems. So there you go. The new sheriffs are, there's more sheriffs in town. No, new cooks in the kitchen. You got more regulators, okay? The Hawaii Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs created a tool for banks to battle ransomware. It's a self-assessment tool to help mitigate the risks. The U.S. Department of Labor Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which sets all of the rules for defined benefit plans, has issued a final interim rule having to do with disclosure of records under the Privacy Act. In terms of events, FINRA is having an artificial intelligence virtual conference and fintech office hours on November 9th to the 10th. Lab CFTC is hosting another Empower Innovation series focused on regulation and innovation reimagined. The Florida Cybersecurity Task Force is meeting on the 15th. The Department of Homeland Security is having an open meeting on October 27th for its Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee. And the FBI is hosting the National Crime Prevention and Privacy Compact Council meeting. In terms of enforcement on these topics, the DOJ seized 91 domain names that were unlawfully used by Iranian entities to engage in a global disinformation campaign. 28 states, via their attorney generals, got a judgment against a health company after a data breach that impacted over 6 million patients. And the fine requires the company, which operates 206 hospitals nationwide, to pay a $5 million payment to the states. South Carolina Department of Insurance put an alert that some insurance companies are not accepting cash as a method of payment, and that is not okay because it has an adverse impact on low-income and elderly consumers who don't have sufficient internet connectivity. And that wasn't it for fines. In our fine tracker, the CFTC issued a report showing that they had a record-breaking enforcement year, 113 more actions than any other year in history. The largest fine ever was last week's JPM $920 million fine, and they had 29 pandemic-related cases. But JPM had slight competition this week because Citibank got fined over $400 million by the Fed and the OCC for long-standing deficiencies in compliance risk management, data quality management, and internal controls. Morgan Stanley also got fined $60 million by the OCC for failing to exercise proper oversight relative to the decommissioning of 2 data centers including a failure in due diligence for selecting a vendor and not monitoring its performance. And I know I already talked about Wells Fargo and the Broadridge letter, but there were two more cases from the OCC that were against actual executives at Wells Fargo. One was for the head of human resources for failures to recognize the inadequate sales incentives, and she was fined $350,000. The second was the head of the deposit products group that served on the Community Banking Risk Management Committee, and he was fined $400,000. In completely random news, the Department of State is restricting the size of au pairs allowed to come to the United States. Oh, childcare, how important you are. And speaking of children, the National Governors Association provided a list of how all of the different states are going to be handling fall activities, Halloween, and Dia de los Muertos during COVID-19. That's it this week for Regulator's US Alerts. Join us every Wednesday morning on LinkedIn, and for the longer version, see us on YouTube.